We've got some beautiful 4-star mushrooms here, and we're going to talk about sautéing them up.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, so Simon, walk us through what you're doing with the chestnut mushrooms.
Yeah, so we're just trimming off the very bottom root, and we're actually going to keep most of the stem. It's all perfectly usable. If you want to take the roots and set them aside, you can make like a really nice mushroom stock or something else with that. But just trimming them up and making them nice and even. So we'll have some that are smaller, obviously, and then some that we're just going to split down the middle so that when we go to saute them, they're all evenly sized and will cook evenly.
Very nice. Are you looking for a certain size, or is that going to kind of depend on the cluster of mushrooms that you get in the clamshell?
No, it's just a personal preference, really. So you could leave them all whole. You could cut them all smaller. For this particular saute session, we're just going to trim them all to about this size, and then kind of match up these other mushrooms that you have in the case with this medley to match the same size.
And how does the size, in your experience, affect how that saute is going to go down?
Yeah, typically you're wanting a smaller size if you want more of that Maillard reaction, which is that caramelization and browning that happens on the outside of the mushroom. That's because these mushrooms have a lot of water content. So especially if you're going to use a smaller pot, you want to cut them smaller and watch how many mushrooms you put in so that heat is maintained. And you're kind of making sure that you're getting that caramelization and that browning before that water content seeps out too much and creates, next thing you know, you'll be cooking your mushrooms in mushroom liquid, and they get really soft and tend to get a little bit more rubbery when you do that.
That is one of the things that we hear so often about mushrooms in general, is people don't like the texture. So I think we're going to learn today.
Yeah, proper technique helps that for sure.
So with the lion's mane mushroom,
yeah,
that's a very different mushroom. A lot of people, it's the first time that they're cooking with it, generally when they buy it from the store. So they have a lot of questions about how to process it. So it looks like you're just chopping it up like you would with the blue oysters.
Yeah, kind of even sizing, exactly the same. There's a lot of things you can do with lion's mane because it is such a different texture and consistency than you might find in other mushrooms. It can cook very much like a steak, kind of almost treat it like chicken, and it gets that same kind of chickeny texture as well. But for this case, since we're just kind of doing this whole medley, just making sure that the sizes are even and rough, and just all together you have your mushrooms ready for sautéing.
A nice consistent mix.
Nice consistent mix, that's right.
All right, for somebody who's never cooked mushrooms before, how do you start out the saute?
Yeah, so you want to heat your pan over medium heat. And you want to let it heat up for a good 3 to 5 minutes so that it gets really, really hot.
And what happens if you start with a cold pan?
If you start with a cold pan, two things are going to happen. No matter how much oil you add to the pan, the mushrooms are going to stick to the bottom. That's because the other thing that happens is if you start at low temperature, the liquid is going to seep out of the mushrooms before you have an opportunity to create that crust and that caramelization, which means kind of there won't be a barrier between the pan and the mushroom itself. So they're all going to stick to the mushroom or to the bottom of the pan, and you're going to end up with a lot of burnt mushroom to the bottom of the pan and very kind of more rubbery, water-logged mushrooms. Once the pan is fully heated, we will add a little bit of oil.
What kind of oil are you using today?
I'm using neutral oil, vegetable oil, so high heat. If you add olive oil to a pan that's hot, it's going to burn right away and your food's going to taste burnt. So you're looking for a high heat oil, one that typically can withstand 400 or 450 degrees before it starts smoking.
Okay. And how does that correlate to somebody's stovetop? Is that on high? Is it 8, 9?
Yeah, so we're going to go medium, which is typically like between 4 and 6, depending on the range, the stove. until the pan is really, really hot. And you'll kind of see when we add the oil, it'll instantly kind of show how hot it is. Once we add the oil, before we add the mushrooms, we're going to turn it all the way up. So now that our pan is hot enough, we are going to take this neutral oil. It's a high smoke point oil, can withstand 450 degrees before it starts to smoke, and then add our mushrooms. You'll hear it sizzle right away. That's what you want. And then you just leave them there. No salt at this point. If you add salt at the beginning, it draws out all the water from the mushrooms, so you run into that same problem where you're taking the water out of the mushrooms before it has an opportunity to cook. It's one of the very few items that you do not salt before you start to cook it.
So how long do you typically let them sit there before you touch them for the first time?
Just until they start to brown. So you can see they're kind of starting to brown on the bottom.
Yeah.
And then the whole definition of saute is bounce. So high heat and moving it, whatever is in the pan around semi-frequently is the technique of sauteing.
Looks like they're getting coated pretty evenly in the oil.
Yeah. Just making sure not too much oil, but enough that they're not going to soak in that oil too much. It's still going to act as that barrier and keep maintaining the heat and help with that caramelization.
Is stainless steel your choice, your go-to?
It's typically my choice, and definitely what I like to use for demonstrations because it's definitely what most people have across the board. It maintains high heat, and as long as you preheat it like we did and add the oil, right before cooking whatever you're cooking in it, you shouldn't have a problem with sticking.
Okay. Those look great.
We're getting there.
And how does a stainless steel pan sauteing mushrooms compare to, say, a cast iron? You wouldn't be doing a saute in a cast
iron? Yeah, I love using cast iron, for sure. Cast iron, same thing, same principle. Heat it over medium. Essentially, you do everything the exact same way you would in a stainless steel.
Same for a non-stick, basically any of your cookware you would...
Yeah, non-stick, you typically you can't get them as hot. So I wouldn't recommend using a non-stick for something like this. They don't tend to get as nice of a browning on them or as even of a cook on them. So I definitely recommend using like a cast iron or stainless steel, even ceramic, something like that. Not to say that it can't be done in a non-stick, it's just not the ideal pan choice for this.
Okay.
All right, now that we've got some nice browning, there you can see there's still no water that you can see coming out of the mushrooms. It's definitely being cooked out of the mushrooms, but that's all just because the steam's being evaporated right away.
It's not pooling.
It's not pooling. It's not causing your mushrooms to start to steam or poach in the pan. Your mushrooms are continuing to still get nice browning in color, and all that water is evaporating right away because of the combination of the pan being heated properly and the oil. At this point, this is where I would typically season the mushrooms. A nice liberal, generous amount of salt. I think always add a little more salt than you think you need. That's my recommendation for most home cooks because I think people tend to err on the side of under seasoning. You can always add a little bit at a time. Taste a mushroom, add a little bit more, taste it until you think you just start to taste the salt itself, and that's when it's seasoned properly.
Okay.
A little bit of black pepper.
Why do most people undersalt their mushrooms?
I think people are scared of salt. In general, I think people are scared of salt. They're scared of making things too salty, and in doing that, in having that fear, they tend to err under season instead of over season.
And what does that do to the mushroom if you don't have enough salt?
You're missing out on amazing flavor. Really, this goes for anything that you're seasoning with salt. Salt brings out all those flavor compounds as they hit your tongue. It really brings out that caramelized, dark, rich, earthy flavor of the mushrooms. So if you're under seasoning, then you're typically left with, I wouldn't say a bland mushroom, especially in your case, but you're not really reaching the maximum potential of what that flavor could be.
Like you mentioned, mushrooms they have such a high water content that it's important to add that salt to really pull that umami flavor out.
Absolutely. Now you could be completely done at this point, you know, especially if you are watching your carbs or anything like that. However, for a nice little finish of flavor, I like to finish with a little bit of butter. And in order to do that, we're just going to take a spoon of butter, turn the heat back down to medium, add that butter, and then we'll also add a little bit of aromatics. In this case, some crushed garlic, a little bit of thyme, and rosemary. And that's just going to add an extra depth of flavor. You know, very classic French technique here, finishing with some nice aromatics. And you can kind of just smell how wonderful that smells now.
Incredible.
All that flavor is going to get worked into the mushrooms. And there we have it. Some beautifully sauteed 4-star mushrooms.
Beautiful. Thank you, chef. It smells amazing.